Today we're interviewing the famous musician of Oregon, Niel DePonte, and he is going to tell us about all his titles and regalias.
Famous? I'm not famous. I'm well known maybe, but I'm not famous.
Please tell us about yourself.
Well, I came here in 1977, and I won an audition, a national audition, to be the principal percussionist of the Oregon Symphony, which was a much smaller orchestra at the time, not even a full-time orchestra. But I was 24 years old and finished my graduate work at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York, as a percussion major, and won this audition to come out here. And I thought, well, I'll come out for 2 years, and then maybe someone will die in the New York Philharmonic or something, and I will audition for that and go forward. And at the age of 24, you don't think you're going to spend your entire career in one city, but sure enough, it turned out that this was a really great city for me to grow and develop, both as a performing musician and as a conductor and a soloist.
Did you win any Grammys? Were you nominated for Grammys?
As a solo percussionist, the Oregon Symphony commissioned for me for its 100th anniversary in 1995 a piece called Concerto for Marimba by the late local composer Tomas Svoboda, who is a Czech composer who defected to this country in the early 70s, I believe, and was on the faculty of Portland State University. And so James DePriest, who was the music director of the Oregon Symphony at the time, went to Tomas and said, "Can you write a concerto for Niel?" And Tomas said, sure. He also had a percussion background. So he wrote a 3-movement work about 22 minutes long, and we recorded it on a recording known as the Orchestral Music of Tomas Svoboda, which was released by Albany Records in New York. And that recording somehow got to the Grammy nomination department of the National Association of Recording Arts and Sciences, NARAS, who runs the Grammy Awards. The recording of the Svoboda piece itself, off of that CD, was nominated for Best Orchestral Solo Recording with Orchestra in the Grammy year 2003. If you win the Grammy, the soloist receives one and the conductor of the orchestra receives one. But I was up against the world's most famous violinist, Maxim Vengerov, who ultimately won, and other orchestras conducted by Rostropovich and things. But as we often say in award shows, it was an honor to be nominated. It was a great moment for me, and I really enjoyed the whole process. I went to the Grammy Awards in February of 2004 in Los Angeles, and it was just fun to be there. So I call it my Lifetime Achievement Award.
And after that you say you're not famous. For Oregon, you're famous.
Well, if you say so. I don't think that way, but thank you.
Where were you getting your education?
Most people who become conductors start out on an instrument of some sort. Percussion is not always the instrument that comes to mind for conductors. I tell people on occasion that a conductor is a drummer who just lost one stick. And there's a little more to it than that. But I think if you want to be a truly well-rounded musician and really understand composition, orchestration, and music in general, I think, and you feel you have some insight into the intentions of composers as they put music on the page, then I think any instrumentalist can be a conductor. I grew up on Long Island, the little fish that goes to the east of New York City, and went to school first at the State University of New York College at Fredonia, which is primarily known for turning out music educators, public school music teachers. The other big state school for educators at the time was Potsdam, from the State University of New York system, which is in way north New York, up by Canada. And it's probably best known for the school who trained Renee Fleming for her undergraduate school. Then all of us who wanted to become performers and professional players, typically you go to a graduate school that is a conservatory. So Renee, I, other friends went to the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York, which is one of the big 5 or 6 conservatories in the country. And my master's degree in the performance certificate in percussion comes from the Eastman School of Music, which is a school that is part of the University of Rochester, a private institution in upstate New York. So a lot of us get our secondary training there. And it was after that, and a stint teaching percussion at the University of Massachusetts for a semester when I was 23, that I took a number of auditions for jobs, performing jobs. Won the Oregon Symphony audition in May of 1977 and moved here in the fall. And the rest, as they say, is history. I've been here ever since.
I know that you personally knew Lonnie Bernstein, and we all just watched Maestro by Bradley Cooper. So tell us about Maestro and how you know him.
Leonard Bernstein was a quite complicated personality. Brilliant man. He was a very good composer. He is one of the few American composers that people in Europe, for instance, will give any credence to for being a decent composer of classical music. He was really the first American-born and trained conductor to take over a major orchestra in this country. Everyone before him had been from Europe. I believe he got his break when he was covering for Bruno Walter with the New York Philharmonic and subbed for him. And of course, that was a big deal in New York papers, and he started to become known. His ascension in the musical ranks is unparalleled in terms of American conductors. And he came along at a time when technology, and there wasn't social media, but there was a lot more technology in terms of video, audio, recordings, and distribution opportunities for classical music, both on the radio, not so much on television. But of course, he made his name doing young people's concerts for CBS and bringing classical music to the masses, and it was the first time that had been done. He probably had the greatest amount of coverage of his life and career than any conductor, certainly than any conductor before him, and possibly than any conductor after him. He was the most documented American conductor in history. And he had brilliant management. A fellow named Harry Kraut was his manager, whom I got to know. I studied with Bernstein in the class, the first conducting class of the Los Angeles Philharmonic Institute in 1982, which was with the Los Angeles Philharmonic. And at the time, they were trying to create Tanglewood West, Tanglewood being the summer festival in the Berkshire Mountains in Massachusetts that's gone on since the era of Serge Koussevitzky, who was the conductor of the Boston Symphony for many, many years. And Tanglewood became this summer retreat where every great classical musician would perform along with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. The film shows Tanglewood. You see Bernstein having sessions. He has lunch with Koussevitzky near the Berkshire Center somewhere early in the film. He goes and teaches a conducting class at the Shed later in the film when he's a much, much older man. The LA Phil Institute only went on for about 4 years, and Bernstein ran it maybe the first 2, and then I think Tilson Thomas ran it, and then it sort of went away. But I was in the first conducting class. There were about 20 of us.
Did you learn anything from him that you remember that this new particular move of the arms or signal into the orchestra you learned from Bernstein?
Well, you have to remember at the time, in 1982, I'm 29 years old. I've already been a principal player in a major orchestra for 5 years of my life. I know a lot about conducting from the player side, and I've already had a chamber orchestra that I conducted and know something about conducting from the conductor side. I had a very different point of view about Bernstein, what a conductor can do and how to get things out of an orchestra. What's your best way to get your point of view artistically across to your orchestra in rehearsals? And what's the best way to mold an interpretation that is being made by human beings, all of whom may think they know more about music than you do, who are sitting there because they're great performers, and you either can inspire them and lead them and they're willing to buy in, or they basically blow you off and they're not willing to buy in. Now, when Bernstein gets on the podium, they're all buying in because he's Bernstein, especially in 1982. He's an established, famous conductor. And this is in the last part of his career. I believe he dies at the end of the decade. So, you're working with Lenny, you want to do your best for Lenny. And yet, Lenny's gestures, if you look at him as a conductor later in his career versus earlier in his career, they get more effusive. In some respects, they get harder to follow if I'm a player. But he's trying to do the energy, impart the energy of the music and how he feels about the music. It sort of became harder and harder, I think, for professional players to read what he was doing. If you knew how he interpreted music from past experiences with him, you could extrapolate what you knew from before and say, he probably means this. And it's our job as players to be able to interpret the words and the gestures of the conductor and to sort of get into their head and bring forth the interpretation that we believe they hear in their head. So that's our job. And then to somehow coordinate the group dynamic about how all of us who are playing are interpreting this information to try and get it to be unified into a cogent musical outcome. That's a big lift for everybody, no matter how good you are as a professional musician. I think Lenny, at times later in his career, made that a little harder for the pros to execute. That having been said, he's still Bernstein. So you're trying to get what you can from him, no matter how he imparts it.
Okay.
So in observing him conducting, you look at gestures where he lets go of the beat. And maybe you shouldn't be afraid to let go of keeping time when you're a conductor. Maybe the time keeps itself for the orchestra, which is often the case. And you want to shape the energy of it rather than try and keep everybody in exactly some metronomic place. So maybe his gestures encourage you to do more of that. Maybe it means that the orchestra will be a little less technically precise, but the sound will be different that comes out of the orchestra because of something he does, or something he does with his face in the performance. Musicians learn more about what the conductor wants from us during rehearsals, because they have a chance to stop and articulate some of the ideas they want to impart. I need more of this, I need less of that. We're not going where I want to go, here's how we get there. I mean, comments like that. In performance, we always go back to what was given in rehearsal. The worst thing a conductor can do is give you improvise in performance. Because you've spent 3 rehearsals trying to understand what he wants, and then suddenly he goes in some other direction. That rarely happens. It did happen once in my performing career at the Oregon Symphony, and it was like chaos, because we thought we knew what the person wanted, and then he was doing all sorts of different things. And it was chaos. It really didn't go very well. But I think Lenny was a brilliant conductor and a brilliant musician, and he knew where he wanted to go. Somehow, at times, the way he instructed his orchestra and some of the gestures, especially in performance, might have been a little more unclear. But certainly the energy and the intention was always there. It was our job as players or the LA Phil's job, to discern out of the ethos sometimes what the conductor wants and where he's going. And if you put together all the information you gathered during rehearsals and all that you know about this conductor from perhaps playing with him before, as the LA Phil would have, you can piece together the direction he wants the group to go, and you go there. That is the art of music making. That is the psychology of 100 individual human beings choosing to work together and try to connect to everybody, and what the psychologist Jung would call the collective unconscious, trying to find that as a group and then bring that outcome forward. That's where the art and the magic happen in musical performance, in my view.
Tell us about your connection to Oregon Ballet.
In 1985, I was approached to develop an orchestra to do a locally produced Nutcracker. We hadn't had a locally produced Nutcracker in this city for at least 10 or 15 years. The local movers and shakers, if you will, in town came to me and said, look, we're trying to restart a ballet company here, and we'd like to produce Nutcracker first. So can you put together an orchestra, and a smaller orchestra than the 60-piece orchestra that typically performs the Nutcracker score? So I said, sure. I was conducting a chamber orchestra at the time called the West Coast Chamber Orchestra, and this ultimately over time became the Oregon Ballet Theatre Orchestra. So we went into the pit with a reduced orchestration that I arranged, in 1985 and did the first locally produced Nutcrackers in at least 10 years here in Portland. And we've been doing them ever since at Oregon Ballet Theatre. So they just keep doing them. We switched to the Balanchine version of the Nutcracker, I don't know, maybe about 15 years ago, roughly. We invented or created our own production of Nutcracker when James Canfield was the artistic director, and it was set in St. Petersburg. It was involved influences from Fabergé eggs and other imperial concepts and ideas from the Tsarist period.
But you never did Petit Pas? The
Well, Petit Pas, no, the Petit Pas solos are always done in Nutcracker. So it's typical in ballet world to keep the famous pas de deux sequences that were done usually by Petit Pas in the second part of Tchaikovsky's career, and to keep all of that choreography. That's the famous choreography, and every production will do that choreography. Other things may change, but not the famous pas de deux.
Not the solos.
Yeah. So that's been my connection. I conducted there until about a year and a half ago. And then I thought it was time with a new artistic team coming in, new artistic director, new executive director. And I was part of the search committee. And I said, it might be time for me to do some other things. There is no retiring, Irina. There's only moving on to different projects.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now we are going to talk about Peter Pan, because I found your name looking at the program, and it was written that Niel is the arrangement master of the music. So what is that?
What does that even mean?
What does it even mean?
All right, let's go all the way back to the beginning. 1999, the choreographer, Trey McIntyre, is the resident choreographer at Oregon Ballet Theatre. He comes to me and says, I'm working on this treatment of the story of Peter Pan, and I need to put music to it. Can you help me? And I said, well, sure, let's work on it. So we begin discussing what music might be used, and we had a number of composers under consideration: Elgar, Tchaikovsky, Mendelssohn. We ultimately had to go to Houston Ballet in Houston, Texas, to try and pitch this idea to them and see if they were interested in putting forward the money to make new sets, new costumes, orchestration. I don't know how much it cost, but it was probably somewhere between $600,000 and $1 million to produce this ballet for Houston Ballet, which is probably the fourth largest ballet company in the country, large enough to do this work. So we start creating it, and as you begin to pick out the music, you have to make a decision if you're going to use multiple composers or one. My dear friend Hermano Florio, who is the music director and conductor for Houston Ballet, said to me, you need to use one. And I said, okay, let it be Elgar. I think there's enough repertoire out there that I can choose a lot of material and make it into this ballet. So when you're an arranger, you take the music of someone else, a composer, and you manipulate it. Sometimes you could take a piano piece and orchestrate it in the style of orchestration that they would use if they were orchestrating it. Or in this case, I took orchestral pieces of Edouard Elgar, and he was very prolific in the realm of orchestral music. I took 22 different orchestral pieces by Elgar from many, from suites, from tone poems, from symphonic work, from symphonies, and I went through and found enough music that I could extract from these pieces and match up the intensity of the music of that moment and the dramatic action, the intensity of the dramatic action of that moment in the story, and match them. Because the music's intensity has to match the storyline's intensity as it flows over time and builds these peaks and valleys of emotional response to what you see and hear. The art of it, frankly, is choosing the correct piece of music and the correct intensity to match the story at any given moment. Once you get that sequence of story and music connected, then you have to look at how long the scenes are that the story is telling. In ballet, most scenes run somewhere from 2.5 to 4.5 minutes long. A pas de deux, which is multiple scenes and multiple movements, can last as long as 8 minutes, but that's usually the biggest chunk of time that you ever cover in a scene in a ballet. Why? Because the dancers can't get out there and keep dancing for more than that amount of time. And so you have to bear in mind these limitations. That means if your second movement, for instance, that is the sword fight in Act 2 of the new ballet version, is, if the second movement is 9 minutes long and your sword fight scene is only 4.5 minutes long, you have to lose 4.5 minutes of music somehow. And you have to make it sound like the piece was written to be 4.5 minutes long. So the arranger says, okay, I've got the front end of the piece here and it repeats over here, and then there's another piece over there, and then there's an interlude over here. So maybe I can take out, we'll keep the repeat because we want something that people will recognize again once they've heard it. Maybe we'll take out, we'll cut the interlude in half, and then we'll slide over this repeated section, but we won't do the whole thing. We'll cut it in half, and then we'll modify the end section and put that on the end. And so now it'll be a contiguous piece of music that's only 4.5 minutes long. That's a lot harder than I just made it sound. To make the harmonies connect correctly and to take all the notes and get them to flow from one half of it to the next part of it to the next part of it is the art of arranging. And so when you think about doing that for 22 different pieces of music, that is a lot of arranging.
Work, yeah.
In addition, I wrote music that sounds like Elgar could have written it, but he didn't. And this music bridges one scene to the next scene so that there are not all these breaks in the ballet, and you have a flow of dramatic energy across time. So there is original work of mine that is interpolated into the work of Elgar periodically. There is a scene where we do capturing of the darling children and the lost boys by the pirates in Act 2. I took music that belongs to a piece called March of the Mughal Emperors from the Crown of India Suite by Elgar. And that piece shows up 4 times in the course of the ballet, so you remember it. But it never shows up the same way twice. It has different cuts, it's longer, it's shorter. And I took sort of a main idea of it and dropped it into this dramatic scene where they're grabbing the lost boys and pulling them into a curtain, behind a curtain. So I had to build a little introduction for it in percussion and then get to this section that it comes directly from it and then change the ending of it, and it's only about 1 minute long. Cool. And we do it again after a small break in the music. We do it again. And so none of that exists on a CD. And so the recording I made, and this was originally done for all these years. We premiered it in 2002 in Houston. And for all these years, for 22 years, it was done with a live orchestra. Because we're creating a version for smaller ballet companies that do not use orchestras, I had to create a recording. And so I took some existing CDs, and the music that doesn't exist on CDs, music I wrote, had to be recorded somewhere. So we were able to find an orchestra that could do it somewhat inexpensively in Riga, Latvia. So the last piece was to take the 40% of the recording that needed to be done live in November of 2023, go to Riga, Latvia, work with the orchestra, edit that material together, and then come back to Portland and put the puzzle pieces together. The CDs, the new recordings that are edited, get the tempos correct for the choreographers, modify the tempos in the electronic studio. We can do magical things now with recording technology, including altering tempos. All of that was put together to create 90 minutes of music that is the ballet score for this version of Peter Pan that you can hear in Portland this month.
Is there any interaction when you were arranging this music with the choreographer?
Oh, yeah.
Or was it just
No,
your work?
it all had to be approved. So when we changed 2 movements, he said, I need to change the first scene in Act 2, and I need to change the third scene in Act 2. What can we do? I don't want to use the music we did use. I know what's supposed to happen dramatically in the scene, and I say, all right, well, I'm not sure what you want to do with the dancers and who's on stage, what characters are on stage, but we could do this. I can abridge the beginning here, and then we can go to what we did use. And then I would grab that Mughal Emperor's music and stick it back here in a very short version, and that'll get you through the next two dramatic items that you have on the list of sequences of scenes. What do you think? When we put it in this position, we play it from the beginning and you play 4 scenes worth. Does it flow for you? Does it work for you? Can you make it work choreographically? And he goes, yes, this is a great idea. I much prefer to hear that than, no, this is a terrible idea. So he said, yes, this will work. And I said, okay, I'll make it happen. And I created the audio for him to work with. Then I had to go back and create the parts in order to record this new version of the march, and that had to be done in Latvia. So all of these coordinations take months and months and months to get into place. So
and we don't have AI that helps with the writing music?
AI and music, you know, it's fine for commercial music, it's fine for pop music.
But not
it's
for
not okay
ballet.
It's not okay for classical music,
Got it.
not yet. And hopefully I'll be long gone by the time AI takes over the world of music.
Okay. This interview is mostly for Russian-speaking people who live in Portland.
Yes.
And what's your participation in Russian music scene before the war, during your years? Did you conduct anything? Did you?
Well, yes, I did. I've conducted in Kazan, which is the home of Nureyev. And so I conducted twice at the Nureyev Ballet Festival in Kazan, which is, at the time, maybe still is part of Tatarstan.
It still is.
Yeah, it's still, yeah. And so then from there, I made connections to St. Petersburg. And while I was able to have the run of the Mariinsky as a wonderful opportunity in 1994, or 93, I think it was, I was there. I was able to go back in 95, having made connections with what was then called the Maly Theatre. It's on Russian Square?
No, it's called Art Square.
Art Square, right.
It's close to Russian Museum.
Yes, exactly so. And so that theater, which is now called the Mussorgsky Theatre, I conducted a Swan Lake there for them. So twice in Kazan, once in St. Petersburg, and then in Khabarovsk on the far eastern side by Mongolia. Khabarovsk is Portland's sister city. So I went there and conducted for 2 of my young artists, the Gloria Chamber Orchestra that was there, and then I did another chamber orchestra concert there. So I have had experiences. It is a great sadness to me that I don't believe I'll be going back to have any more experiences under the circumstances. And I find the war a great tragedy. In response to that, I wrote a piece for woodwind quintet and piano that is entitled My Kiev, My Heart. And it was premiered 2 summers ago at my Barn Festival and takes in some of the folk songs of the Ukrainian people, including what is the Ukrainian national anthem, the Ukrainian national prayer music, and some other songs. And so that was my response at the time, now 2 years ago, to the beginnings of what I consider to be a very tragic war.
I would say, like, last question is, what are your plans for this summer, for this year, and for the next couple of years?
My nonprofit, DePonte Creativity Partners, always is making new concerts, new ideas. We have the Barn concerts, the concerts at thebarn.com for July 24th through August 28th. And so you'll see many performers there. It's that place where I did the My Kiev, My Heart piece originally. I mean, there are many of my Russian friends come to these concerts and enjoy them out on the lawn, inside the barn, at the Hoffman Farm store. So producing those concerts takes a certain amount of time. I also have recording projects at work through DePonte Creativity Partners, and the people who support me, I have sponsors, God bless them for their donations, to make these things possible for the nonprofit organization. I commissioned the work from a Portland composer named Kenji Bunch a wonderful work for percussion soloist, string quartet, and piano. And one of my goals is to increase the amount of repertory for chamber music that involves percussion instruments as melodic instruments who carry the melody. So a lot of marimba, a lot of vibraphone, trying to equalize these voices with the strings or the piano and try and give people the sense that percussion can be a very melodic and quite beautiful instrument of expression. The Kenji Bunch piece is called Trackings. It's a 5-movement work. It was premiered last June 29th, and I'll be working on making a recording of that and finishing another recording with my former young artist Ben Kim of the Bartok Sonata for 2 pianos and 2 percussionists. We're doing it with 1 pianist and 1 percussionist and overdubbing. So this will be a rather unique approach to the piece. So there's plenty to do, and I'm always coming up with new ideas. So stay tuned for the next iteration of DePonte Creativity Partners projects, because I'm sure there'll be many of them.
Thank you very much for finding time to come and interview with us.
My great pleasure. Спасибо большое.